one's interpretation. But at the same time, the 50 shades of grey that life can present to the people in the real world demand that we walk with each other in the search for truth and love. It is more important to walk the talk than simply to talk the talk. The Judeo-Christian story is a narrative of hope and despair, and of reordering human relationships in the light of unfolding revelation. It began with a story in Genesis, where the seed of hope was sown and the promise of redemption was made in the face of sin and brokenness. Then the story of the great exile puts in bold relief how hope was born in a situation of utter vulnerability. So in the light of this experience, there occurred a paradigm shift in the way that people relate to God and to others. A vengeful, jealous, petty tribal deity gave way to a much more expansive, broader vision of the divine. Not God, but God changed. God remained unchanged, but our understanding, our appreciation of who God is does. So the Jews in exile expanded their vision of God, a truly universal and all-embracing God. And as a consequence, human relationships and social structures too were reordered in a way that was consonant with the evolving consciousness. The Judeo-Christian story finds its ultimate expression in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, who is the source and the ground of our hope and renewal. But it also continues to unfold throughout history, especially at its pivotal moments. And so when persecution forced the church to disperse from her Jewish home in Palestine, she learned to welcome the Gentiles, the non-Jewish people, and became the refuge for the persecuted. When she came out of the catacombs into imperial Christendom, places of learning and contemplation and prayer and solidarity sprung up in response to the thirst for more authentic discipleship, hope and renewal. So now we find ourselves in yet another pivotal moment in history. Just as the Berlin Wall collapsed, the walls of Christendom have been blown away by the wind of secularization. So we are forced to move out of our catacombs into the open, into this very strange, alien, unfamiliar world of postmodernity, where nothing is taken for granted as far as faith is concerned. Like disciples on the Sea of Galilee, we are roused by the Spirit of Jesus to launch the bark of Peter into deeper waters. Here in this new exile, in the inhospitable landscape, we must learn to walk with others, other faiths, other traditions, other voices, including those who oppose or are critical of us. We learn to be humble servants of the kingdom and the sacrament of God's love and presence in the world. As we are cut loose from the safe and secure moorings of the past and launched into treacherous waters of the future, we grow in our awareness of the Paschal rhythm. We realize what needs to die and what needs to rise. You know, there are many prophets of doom around. They tell us, hey, the Catholic Church is dying. All these signs around us, they tell us. And I wager that they are right. But only half right. Half right. Because they fail to see the other side of the equation. The church is dying, yes, but only dying to that which is not of Christ. And it is rising again to what Christ and His gospel stand for. It is dying to worldly trappings, triumphalism, clericalism, but it is rising again to the power of love, the power of fallibility, servant leadership, a discipleship of radical love. That's what we need to rise to. So all is not lost, my dear, despite appearances to the contrary. In fact, there are signs of new life sprouting forth in the seemingly barren religious landscape, even here in secular Australia. We can see them in the young and old, in the city and the country, among the mainstream society and on the margins, in our schools and in our parishes. We see them in the young and their passion for justice, equality, and integrity of creation. We see them in the not so young and their concern for the down and out, the asylum seekers, refugees, indigenous peoples. We see them in the fights on behalf of those who suffer injustice and the broader vision of life in its fullness, which is at the very core of the gospel. So the good news tonight, my dear people, is the church is being cleansed, renewed, and revitalized. The sign of the time is the way the church acts as a leaven in a pluralistic society. The Second Vatican Council taught us that it is a pilgrim church who walks humbly with others and engages with them in the discernment of authentic values and in the search for and in the delivery of the fullness of life in the world. So in this context, being missionary is not only about converting others to our system of beliefs and practices. You know the story of Francis and the Sultan of Egypt, that is. Francis went to Egypt intending to convert the Sultan and his followers, the Muslims, to Catholicism. But he failed. He failed quite spectacularly. Not a soul was won over to Catholicism or Christianity as a result of his effort. But you know what? There's something much more magnificent that came out of the encounter between Francis and the Sultan. As Francis began to listen to the Sultan, he grew in appreciation of their faith tradition, their story. And Francis came home profoundly impacted by the encounter. And he also had the same deep impact on the Sultan himself. So that the Sultan commanded his people, his followers, that they must respect Francis and his religion. Which is why Francis is still considered a prophet among the Muslims, like a saint in our tradition. And this is why in Assisi, every now and again, is that meeting between leaders of other faiths and religions because of what Francis did. So Francis, where am I? Some of you might have seen the film called Of Man and God. And this film, for me, embodies the spirit of new evangelization, which is about being open to the mystery of God, who is already at work in other faiths and religions. It is like St. Paul telling the pagans in Athens that they are already religious, even though they worship an unknown God. Benedict XVI talks about the church being the courtyard of the Gentiles, which is the same idea. And I contend that this is yet another sign of Christ rising again in the church, through her being a companion, a humble servant, a fellow pilgrim, and a leaven to society and to the world. And finally, I believe that one of the greatest signs of new life in the church, Christ rising again today, is you. Yes, it's called the arrival of the age, the laity, and the increasing awareness of their core responsibility in the building up of the kingdom. I contend that the increasing awareness of the role of all the baptized and their involvement in every aspect of the church's life are the fruit of the council and a positive step for her mission. I contend that the reality of God's kingdom of peace and justice is becoming more and more central, a central commitment for believers of all stripes. This is a sign of Christ rising again today in the church. So in summary, my dear people, I believe we are living in a time of grace and hope precisely because this fallow time allows us to divest or to rid ourselves of all that is unworthy of Christ and His gospel, and simultaneously to grow more deeply in our identity and mission as disciples. Hence, it is the time to die before we can rise up again. This winter time is the time for the church to die to worldly culture of power and dominance, and to rise to the gospel-inspired culture of simplicity, vulnerability, and powerlessness. The greatest in the kingdom of God is the one who humbled himself as a little child. Jesus teaching about powerlessness and simplicity and vulnerability. So, time for us to rise to that core value of the gospel. It is a time for us to, as a church, to die to being enclosure only for the virtuous and the privileged, and to rise to becoming an oasis for the poor and the inner wing of God. The inner wing are the blessed poor in the exile. To die to an experience of exclusion and condemnation, and to rise to being an encounter of radical love, inclusion and solidarity. To die to the leadership of control and clericalism, and to rise to the leadership of collegiality and a diaconia of humble servant, exemplified by Christ at the Last Supper. So, my dear people, despite all appearances to the contrary, I firmly believe that we are on the threshold of renewal and transformation. The Vatican Council set in motion a new paradigm that cannot be pushed back by fear and paralysis. That new paradigm is one that is based on mutuality, not exclusion, and love, not fear, service, not clericalism, engagement with the world, and not